For her presentation. I understand we're ready to go back to Mr. Adam Hadley, Executive Director at Tech Against Terrorism, who will also participate via VTC. Mr. Hadley, you have the floor.
Thank you. Hello, good morning. I am Adam Hadley, Executive Director at Tech Against Terrorism. First and foremost, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and the CTC, and of course UNCTED for inviting us to present today. Over the next few minutes, I will explain who we are, what we do, the challenges we're working on, and crucially, the critical role that public-private partnerships play in helping address such a complex and fundamental challenge. We are a public-private partnership initiated by UNCTED in 2016. We are an independent not-for-profit, and we work with all the major stakeholders in this area, including the large tech platforms and the industry-owned and industry-led Global Internet Forum to Counter-Terrorism, as well as a whole range of smaller and medium-sized platforms. In addition to this, we work with governments, international organizations, and civil society. Our purpose is to disrupt the terrorist use of the internet, primarily by supporting smaller platforms, but recognizing that it's critical to involve a broad network of stakeholders in order to bring this about. As a public-private partnership, we are not a tech company, big or small. We're not a government. We're not civil society. We're none of these things. And we work hard to navigate a complex environment in which there are a number of trade-offs and incentives in all parts of the ecosystem. Fundamentally, a public-private partnership is very difficult to run because the need to balance perspectives, the need to try and influence but not coerce. Nevertheless, at Tech Against Terrorism, we believe in providing real value to platforms we work with. We support all of the platforms on here and many more. In total, we work with around 100 platforms, big and small. So what do we do? The first part of what we do is understanding the threat and how terrorists use the internet. And we have our own in-house team of open source intelligence analysts who are monitoring around 100 platforms at any one point for emerging terrorist content. Secondly, we support platforms in a practical sense. It's very, very important that we provide operational support to them. We have online resources. We conduct regulatory analysis, we run workshops and webinars, and also we support the industry-led initiative, the Global Internet Forum to Counter-Terrorism, by providing a mentorship service in order to support the membership of the GIFCT. Thirdly, we build technology, and we have an in-house team of developers and technologists, and the main product and tool we have is the Terrorist Content Analytics platform that analyzes, alerts, and archives terrorist content. We also provide engineering support to platforms because often smaller platforms have limited capacity and capability to implement technical approaches on their own. Platforms we work with, some are listed here. We know, of course, that terrorists use a range of platforms, as we all do. Many are dual purpose, and that presents some challenges about creating norms so as to ensure that when dealing with terrorist content, we're also upholding human rights and fundamental freedoms. But continuing the theme started by Priyank, it's also important to stress that terrorists are opportunistic and will try using new technologies as they emerge. And this, unfortunately, is the case with generative AI web products. In many senses, though, the landscape is becoming more complex by the day as a result of the proliferation of additional technologies. And generative AI technologies are, of course, proliferating. These are just some of the top 50 over the summer. I dare say there are another 50, 200, 500 platforms that can be used as well, or services. We are currently analyzing the use of large language models and generative AI based on this framework. So primarily we work to understand the purpose of terrorist use of the internet. That is still primarily sharing propaganda, recruitment and radicalization, but there are a number of other use cases, disseminating content, circumventing content moderation, and of course operational planning and upskilling. So when analysing the terrorist use of the internet, especially where generative AI is concerned, we believe it's imperative to understand what the use case is and to use this to reach out to platforms and build partnerships with them and help them stress test and red team to ensure that terrorists can't use that technology with impunity. What we're seeing so far is that there is some limited evidence of terrorist use of generative AI. We've archived around 10,000 examples of Gen AI created imagery and videos. However, at present, this is not widespread or particularly significant, but certainly something worth bearing in mind for all of the reasons that Priyank highlighted earlier. Whilst these innovations must be mitigated, we believe that focus should not shift from countering proven tactics. So the traditional way we would think about this is looking at this taxonomy, thinking through propaganda, operational use cases, emerging technology. And this is still the case. And the current crisis in the Middle East reflects this as well. Generative AI is very important to consider, as is decentralized technologies. But we must not forget to focus on the basics. The tech sector is certainly doing much better than it ever has done before, but the threat is still there. Terrorists are still able to use tried and tested methods to share terrorist content and propaganda. And therefore, we implore stakeholders to ensure that focus does not drift from the perhaps less sophisticated but more successful methodologies that they've used in the past. One way in which we're concerned is terrorist-operated websites. We are currently tracking more than 300 websites created by designated terrorist organizations. These are often supported by more than 30 different website infrastructure providers. So this shows the formidable challenge we have in reaching out to these companies and trying to build partnerships with them. It's incredibly difficult to do this because of the broad number of platforms that are brought into this. We believe that terrorists do not have the right to operate their own websites. Nevertheless, there is a persistent and significant presence of terrorist-operated websites on the internet. And as big tech platforms have improved their response, so terrorists have responded by setting up their own websites. Back to the future, you could say. Also, just to conclude, to some extent, we are seeing terrorists returning to normal methodologies. And when considering the Israel-Hamas conflict at the moment, we are seeing a vast amount of normal terrorist content, if you like, being shared on social media and messaging apps. Much of this comes from one messaging app in particular. The majority of this content is branded and includes images of victims and attacks. So the problems of, let's say, 2016, when we were founded, in many senses are still there. Whilst it's important to focus on new technology, we're still not out of the woods in terms of the terrorist use of traditional approaches. And there's one messaging app in particular where there's a major channel, and this has nearly 700,000 subscribers. And to be clear, this is associated with a designated terrorist organization. So on that, I will conclude to say that public-private partnerships are very difficult because of the tensions that exist naturally. There's a formidable amount of work that's required to do to reach out to all the stakeholders to ensure that there's consistency in the way platforms are being requested to deal with this, and fundamentally in upholding human rights and fundamental freedoms. So with that, thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Hadley for his presentation. This concludes segment 2 of the meeting. Who wish to make any further comments, and I give the floor to Mr. Adam Hadley. Mr. Hadley, you have the floor.
Mr. Speaker, many thanks. Responding to one question from the floor, I believe from the Russian Federation, regarding the normative basis of terrorist content removal and the consistency with which the tech sector does this. At Tech Against Terrorism, we believe that human rights and freedom of expression is essential in countering the terrorist use of the internet. For we believe that if we do not uphold the rule of law, we are letting terrorists win. With that in mind, at Tech Against Terrorism, we only focus on content that has been created by designated terrorist organizations and has been officially branded. We recognize that this excludes a large amount of content that might be considered sub-threshold, but nevertheless, we think it's very important to be extremely clear about the scope of activity that we're supporting. More information about the scope of our work is available on our website, but for the most part, we reference the UN and UN lists of designated terrorist organizations, and then we recommend that tech companies reflect this in practice in terms of upholding their terms of service. But nevertheless, we believe that tech companies are to be encouraged voluntarily to uphold their terms of service, and also to be held to account when this doesn't happen. So the designation that we rely on is kind of UN-based or US, or EU, and is clear on our site. And certainly there is so much egregious content produced by designated terrorist organizations that we believe that should be the focus for now. And we believe that it's important that the perfect is not the enemy of the good. We also work extensively with a number of countries and regulators to promulgate and promote best practice in terms of how online regulation is being adopted by the tech sector. Foremost amongst this is an initiative that we are running on behalf of the European Union called Tech Against Terrorism Europe, which works with tech companies based in the EU in a consortium with universities across the EU to promote best practice regarding the terrorist content online regulation and also the Digital Services Act. Much like the EU has led the way with GDPR, we believe that TCO and DSA also does the same. And it's very clear about the scope that it believes platforms should uphold with regards to the removal of terrorist content. Finally, I would say that transparency reporting is really important here, because we'd agree that there is a risk that platforms are not taking their responsibilities seriously enough, when there is a risk that platforms are pressured into removing content that isn't terrorist content. We believe that there's a significant risk where the terrorist use of the internet is concerned, that terrorism can become weaponized for political reasons. And therefore, transparency is a great way of ensuring that tech platforms are removing what they should be. And we also believe that transparency from governments is really good as well, because with transparency, we believe that increases trust and confidence in the measures that the tech sector is developing to ensure that the most egregious content is removed from the internet in a timely fashion. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Hadley for those additional remarks. Invited guest colleagues, I don't see any further requests for the floor.